The alarm clock buzzed at 6:30 a.m., but Judge Patricia Williams was already awake. She had been lying in bed for the past 20 minutes, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the day ahead. Today wasn't going to be just another ordinary Tuesday at the courthouse. She had several important cases on her docket, including one that had been making headlines for weeks. Patricia rolled over and looked at her husband sleeping peacefully beside her. After 23 years of marriage, David still looked like the college professor she had fallen in love with. His graying beard moved slightly with each breath, and she smiled despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. She slipped out of bed quietly, not wanting to wake him. The hardwood floors were cold against her bare feet as she made her way to the kitchen. The coffee maker was already programmed to start brewing at 6:15, filling the house with the rich aroma of her favorite Colombian blend. As she poured her first cup of the day, Patricia's mind wandered to the cases she would be hearing. The most significant one involved allegations of police misconduct during a traffic stop that had gone viral on social media. The video showed officers using what many considered excessive force during an arrest. The case had divided the community, with some supporting the officers and others demanding justice for the victim. Patricia had been a judge for 12 years, and she had seen her fair share of controversial cases. But this one felt different. The tensions in the city had been building for months, and she knew that whatever decision she made would be scrutinized by everyone from local activists to national media outlets. She walked to the window and looked out at her garden. The roses she had planted last spring were beginning to bloom, their pink petals catching the early morning light. Gardening had always been her way of finding peace, a way to connect with something simple and beautiful in a world that often seemed complicated and harsh. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text message from her daughter Lisa, who was in her second year of law school. "Good luck today, Mom. I know you'll do the right thing. Love you." Patricia smiled and typed back quickly. "Thanks, sweetheart. See you this weekend." Lisa had always been her biggest supporter, even during the difficult years when Patricia was working her way up through the legal system. Being a black woman in the judiciary hadn't been easy, especially in the early days of her career. She had faced skepticism, prejudice, and countless moments when people assumed she was less qualified than her male or white counterparts. But Patricia had persevered. She had graduated at the top of her class from law school, worked as a prosecutor for 8 years, and then served as a defense attorney for another 6 before being appointed to the bench. Every step of the way, she had proven herself through hard work, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The shower felt good against her skin, washing away the lingering tension from her restless night. As she stood under the hot water, Patricia thought about her grandmother who had passed away 5 years earlier. Grandma Rose had been born in 1925, living through segregation, the civil rights movement, and decades of slow but steady progress. "Baby girl," her grandmother used to say, "you're going to do things I never could have dreamed of. But remember, with great opportunity comes great responsibility. You carry the hopes of everyone who came before you." Those words had guided Patricia throughout her career. Every time she put on her judicial robes, she felt the weight of that responsibility. She wasn't just Patricia Williams, judge. She was a symbol of progress, a reminder that the legal system could evolve and become more inclusive. After getting dressed, Patricia looked at herself in the mirror. She had chosen a simple navy blue dress with a matching blazer. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she wore minimal jewelry, just her wedding ring and small pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother. She usually changed into her judicial robes once she arrived at the courthouse, but today she planned to stop by her chambers early to review some last-minute documents. The private judge's entrance would save her time and allow her to avoid the crowds that often gathered on high-profile case days. Downstairs, David was now awake and making breakfast. The smell of bacon filled the kitchen, and he had already set out her favorite whole wheat toast with strawberry jam. "Big day today," he said, not looking up from the stove. "They're all big days," Patricia replied, but she knew what he meant. David turned around and studied her face. After more than 2 decades together, he could read her emotions better than anyone. You're worried about something. Patricia sat down at the kitchen table and sipped her coffee. It's just, this case has everyone so worked up. I've been getting emails and phone calls all week. Some people want me to throw the book at these officers, others think they were just doing their job. Everyone seems to have already made up their minds. But you haven't made up yours, David said. It wasn't a question. No, I haven't, and I won't until I hear all the evidence. That's how the system is supposed to work, even when it's unpopular. David walked over and kissed the top of her head. That's why you're the judge and they're not. Patricia finished her breakfast quickly, glancing at her watch. She wanted to get to the courthouse by 8 a.m., even though her first case wasn't scheduled until 9:30. The extra time would help her feel more prepared and centered. She gathered her briefcase, which contained her laptop, legal pad, and several case files. Her judicial identification badge was in its usual spot in the front pocket, easily accessible for security checkpoints. I should be home by 7 tonight, she told David as she headed toward the garage. I'll make your favorite dinner, he called, after her. Grilled salmon with that lemon herb sauce you love. Patricia smiled as she got into her car. David always knew how to take care of her, especially on stressful days. Their marriage had weathered many storms, including the demanding schedule of her judicial career and the public scrutiny that came with high-profile cases. The drive to downtown usually took about 25 minutes, but Patricia liked to leave early to avoid the worst of the rush-hour traffic. She listened to classical music during the drive, letting the familiar melodies calm her mind. Today she had chosen Pachelbel's Canon in D, a piece that never failed to center her thoughts. Sao, sao, sao. She drove through the city. Patricia noticed the changes that had taken place over the years. New apartment buildings rose beside old warehouses that had been converted into trendy restaurants and shops. The downtown area was experiencing a renaissance, but it also meant that longtime residents were being pushed out by rising costs. These were the kinds of social and economic issues that often found their way into her courtroom. Petty crimes that stemmed from poverty, family disputes that arose from financial stress, and conflicts between different communities that were competing for limited resources. Patricia pulled into the courthouse parking garage and found her usual spot on the 3rd level. As she gathered her things from the car, she noticed that her hands were slightly trembling. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that she had handled hundreds of difficult cases. This one would be no different. The parking garage was busier than usual, filled with reporters, lawyers, and curious onlookers who wanted to observe the high-profile hearing. Patricia recognized several faces from previous cases, including attorneys she had worked with over the years. She walked toward the elevator, planning to take it down to the basement level where she could access the judge's private entrance. But as she approached, she noticed a handwritten sign taped to the elevator doors. Out of order, maintenance in progress. Patricia sighed and looked around for an alternative. There was another elevator on the opposite side of the garage, but it would take her to the main public entrance instead of the private judge's entrance. She glanced at her watch, 7:45 a.m. She still had plenty of time. The second elevator was older and slower, creaking slightly as it descended to the ground floor. When the doors opened, Patricia found herself in the main lobby of the courthouse, surrounded by the usual morning crowd of lawyers, defendants, witnesses, and family members. The lobby was busier than she had expected. Word about today's hearing had clearly spread throughout the community, and people had come early to secure seats in the courtroom. Patricia could hear fragments of conversations as she walked toward the security checkpoint. I hope those cops get what they deserve, said one woman to her friend. The whole thing is blown out of proportion, replied an older man reading a newspaper. Police have a tough job. Patricia kept her expression neutral as she listened to these exchanges. She had learned long ago not to let outside opinions influence her judicial decisions, but it was always interesting to gauge public sentiment. The security line was longer than usual, and Patricia found herself standing behind a young mother with 2 small children. The woman was clearly stressed, trying to keep her kids quiet while juggling a diaper bag and several folders of what looked like legal documents. Excuse me, the woman said, turning to Patricia. Do you know if they have a family waiting area? I'm supposed to testify in a custody hearing. but I don't know what to do with my kids. Officer Michael Collins had been having a rough morning even before he stepped foot in the courthouse. His coffee maker had broken, his uniform shirt had a small stain that he couldn't get out, and his partner Danny Torres had been complaining about everything from the weather to their sergeant's new policy changes during the entire drive downtown. "I'm telling you, Mike," Danny was saying as they parked their patrol car outside the courthouse, "this whole department is going soft. All this sensitivity training and community outreach nonsense. Back in my dad's day, cops were cops and criminals were criminals. None of this gray area stuff." Michael nodded along, though he wasn't really listening. At 34, he had been on the force for 8 years, and he was tired of Danny's constant complaints. Danny was 26 and had been a police officer for only 3 years. But he acted like he had decades of experience. They were at the courthouse to provide extra security for what everyone expected to be a contentious hearing. The case involving allegations of police misconduct had the whole department on edge. Some officers felt like they were under attack, while others believed that bad cops should be held accountable just like anyone else. Michael fell somewhere, in the middle. He had seen good officers and bad officers during his career. Most cops, in his experience, were decent people trying to do a difficult job. But he also knew that the badge could attract people who enjoyed having power over others. "Look, at all these protesters," Danny said, gesturing toward a small group of people holding signs near the courthouse steps. "Probably don't have jobs to go to." Michael sighed. The protesters were peaceful, standing quietly with signs that read, "Justice for all" and "Hold police accountable." They had every right to be there, and they weren't causing any trouble. "Come on," Michael said. "Let's just get inside and do our job." The courthouse lobby was more crowded than usual, filled with lawyers, reporters, and people who had come to observe the hearing. Michael and Danny positioned themselves near the main entrance, watching for any signs of trouble. Their supervisor, Lieutenant Karen Rodriguez, had briefed them that morning about what to expect. "Just keep your eyes open," she had said. "We're not expecting any real problems, but emotions are running high. If you see anything suspicious, let me know immediately." For the first hour, everything was routine. People came and went through the security checkpoint. Lawyers chatted with their clients, and the usual courthouse business proceeded normally. Michael was starting to think it would be a quiet day when Danny nudged him with his elbow. "Check out that woman over there," Danny said, nodding toward the security line. "She's acting nervous about something." Michael looked in the direction. Danny was pointing and saw a well-dressed black woman in a navy blue dress and blazer. She was standing in line behind a mother with 2 young children, and from what Michael could see, she appeared to be behaving normally. "She looks fine too." Michael said. "No, man, look at her body language. She keeps looking around like she's planning something. And did you see how she was talking to that woman with the kids? Could be passing information or something." Michael frowned. He had learned during his years on the force that Danny had a tendency to see threats where none existed, especially when it came to people of color. It was something that made Michael uncomfortable, but he had never directly confronted his partner about it. "Danny, she's just standing in line like everyone else. I'm telling you, something's not right about her. Look, she's reaching for something in her bag. Could be a weapon." Michael watched as the woman began to reach into her briefcase, presumably for identification to show security. It was exactly what everyone in line was doing when they reached the checkpoint. "She's getting her ID," Michael said. "That's what you're supposed to do." But Danny was already moving, his hand resting on his service weapon. "We should check her out. Better safe than sorry." Michael felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had been in situations like this before with Danny, where his partner's suspicions escalated routine encounters into confrontations. Usually, Michael was able to de-escalate things before they got out of hand. "Let's just observe for now," Michael suggested. "If security has a problem with her, they'll handle it." Danny ignored him and began walking toward the woman. Michael reluctantly followed, hoping he could prevent whatever his partner was planning from going too far. The woman had made it through the security checkpoint and was walking toward the elevators. She moved with confidence and purpose, like someone who was familiar with the courthouse layout. To Michael, she looked like a lawyer or court employee, not someone who was up to anything suspicious. "Ma'am," Danny called out loudly. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you." The woman turned around and Michael could see confusion on her face. She looked back and forth between the two officers, clearly wondering why they wanted to talk to her. "Is there a problem, officers?" she asked politely. Danny stepped closer, his posture aggressive. "We've been watching you and you're acting suspicious. What's your business here today?" The woman's expression shifted from confusion to annoyance. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand what you mean by suspicious. I went through security like everyone else." "You were casing the place," Danny insisted, looking around, talking to people, reaching for things in your bag. "We want to know what you're really doing here." Michael could see that the woman was trying to remain calm, but there was a spark of anger in her eyes. Other people in the lobby were starting to notice the confrontation, and Michael felt embarrassed by his partner's behavior. "Officer," the woman said, her voice taking on a firmer tone, "I can assure you that I have every right to be here. If you'll allow me to show you my identification, this misunderstanding can be cleared up very quickly." She began to reach for her briefcase again, but Danny quickly stepped forward and grabbed her wrist. "Don't reach for anything," he snapped. "Keep your hands where we can see them." "Danny," Michael said quietly, "this is getting out of hand." But his partner wasn't listening. The confrontation was attracting more attention, and Michael could see several people taking out their phones to record what was happening. "I'm trying to show you my identification," the woman said, her voice rising slightly. "You asked me what my business is here, and I'm attempting to answer your question." "We'll determine what you can and can't do," Danny replied. "Right now, you need to explain why you were acting suspicious." The woman took a deep breath, and Michael could see her struggling to maintain her composure. "Officer, I was not acting suspicious. I was simply going through the normal security process like everyone else in this building. I am a regular visitor to this courthouse, and I have never had any problems before." "Regular visitor, huh?" Danny said sarcastically. "What kind of regular visitor? You got a lot of court dates?" Michael winced at his partner's implication. Danny was clearly suggesting that the woman was a frequent defendant, and it was obvious to everyone listening that his assumption was based on her race. "That's not what I meant," the woman said, her patience clearly wearing thin. "I work in this building." "Oh, really?" Danny laughed. "Doing what? Cleaning offices?" The insult hung in the air like a slap. Michael saw several lawyers and court employees stop what they were doing to stare at the scene unfolding before them. Some looked shocked, others angry, and a few appeared to recognize the woman, though Michael couldn't understand why. "Officer Torres," the woman said, reading Danny's name tag, "your behavior is completely inappropriate and unprofessional. I demand to speak with your supervisor immediately." Danny's face reddened at being called out in front of so many people. "You don't get to demand anything. You were acting suspicious, and now you're being belligerent. That's enough reason for us to detain you for questioning." "Detain me?" the woman said, her voice rising. "On what grounds? I haven't committed any crime. I haven't violated any laws. I have been nothing but cooperative since you approached me." Michael knew she was right. They had no legal justification for detaining her, and Danny's behavior was escalating a situation that should have been resolved in the first 30 seconds. He tried to step forward to intervene, but Danny blocked his path. "Danny, we should back off," Michael said loud enough for his partner to hear. "No way," Danny replied. "This woman thinks she can just mouth off to police officers. She needs to learn some respect." "I am showing you respect," the woman said firmly. "But respect goes both ways. You have treated me with suspicion and hostility from the moment you approached me, despite the fact that I have done nothing wrong." Her words were measured and precise, spoken like someone who was accustomed to being heard and taken seriously. Michael was beginning to suspect that she might be a lawyer or someone else with legal training. "Look, ma'am," Michael said, trying to de-escalate the situation, "maybe we can start over. If you could just show us some identification, we can clear this up quickly." The woman looked at him with a mixture of relief and frustration. "Thank you, officer. That's all I've been trying to do." She slowly reached for her briefcase, moving deliberately so that both officers could see her actions. But just as she was about to open it, Danny stepped forward again. "I changed my mind," he said. "I don't like your attitude. Maybe you need to spend some time thinking." The sound of the slap seemed to echo forever in the courthouse lobby. Judge Patricia Williams felt the sting across her left cheek, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the shock and humiliation of what had just happened. In 38 years of life and 12 years as a sitting judge, she had never experienced anything like this. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia could sense dozens of eyes on her, but she couldn't bring herself to look at the faces around her. Instead, she focused on maintaining her composure, drawing on years of judicial training that had taught her to remain calm under pressure. Officer Danny Torres stood frozen in front of her, his hand still raised from the slap. His face had gone pale, and his eyes were wide with something that might have been shock at his own actions. For a moment, he looked like a child who had broken something valuable and was waiting for the consequences to arrive. His partner, Officer Michael Collins, appeared to be in a state of complete disbelief. His mouth was open, and he kept looking back and forth between Danny and Patricia as if trying to process what he had just witnessed. "Danny," Michael whispered, barely audible. "What did you just do?" Patricia slowly raised her hand to her cheek, feeling the heat where Danny's palm had made contact. The red mark would be visible for hours, a physical reminder of this moment of degradation and assault. Around the lobby, people were beginning to react to what they had seen. Someone gasped, audibly. Another person muttered, "Oh my God," under their breath. Patricia could hear the soft buzzing of cell phones as people began recording video and taking pictures. Attorney Jennifer Walsh had been standing near the information desk when the confrontation began. She recognized Judge Williams immediately and had been watching the interaction with growing alarm. When the slap happened, Jennifer felt her stomach drop. She had appeared before Judge Williams dozens of times over the past 5 years, and she knew her to be one of the most respected jurists in the district. "This can't be happening," Jennifer said to her colleague, Attorney Robert Chen, who was standing beside her. Robert was equally stunned. Did that officer just hit Judge Williams? The question hung in the air because neither of them could quite believe what they had witnessed. Police officers didn't slap judges. It was unthinkable, a violation of every principle that governed the relationship between law enforcement and the judiciary. Court reporter Angela Martinez had been on her way to the elevators when she heard the commotion. She turned to see what was happening just in time to witness the assault. Angela had worked in the courthouse for 15 years, and she had transcribed thousands of hours of Judge Williams' proceedings. She knew the judge to be fair, thoughtful, and unfailingly professional. "Judge Williams," Angela called out, starting to move toward her. But Patricia held up a hand, signaling for Angela to stay back. She needed to handle this situation carefully. Every action she took in the next few minutes would be scrutinized and analyzed. She had to think not just as Patricia Williams, the woman who had been assaulted, but as Judge Williams, a representative of the judicial system. Danny Torres was beginning to realize the magnitude of what he had done. The woman he had just struck was clearly not some random courthouse visitor. The way other people were reacting, the shocked expressions on lawyers' faces, the whispered conversations that were starting to ripple through the crowd, it all pointed to the fact that he had made a terrible mistake. Who are you?" Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Patricia looked at him with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. This young officer had let his prejudices and anger control his actions, and now he would have to live with the consequences. "I tried to tell you," Patricia said quietly. "I tried to show you my identification, but you weren't interested in listening." Lieutenant Karen Rodriguez had been pushing through the crowd, trying to reach her officers. She had heard raised voices and seen people gathering, but the lobby was crowded and she couldn't initially see what was happening. It wasn't until she got closer that she realized one of her officers was involved in some kind of confrontation. When she finally broke through the circle of onlookers, Karen saw Danny and Michael standing in front of a well-dressed black woman, who was holding her hand to her cheek. The woman looked familiar, but Karen couldn't immediately place her. "What's going on here?" Karen demanded, looking between her two officers. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was still trying to process what had happened and figure out how to explain it to his supervisor. Danny, meanwhile, was staring at Patricia with a growing sense of dread. Something about her bearing, the way she carried herself, the obvious respect that other people in the lobby were showing her, it all suggested that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. "Officers," Patricia said, addressing all three of them, "I believe this situation has gone far enough. I'm going to show you my identification now, and then we can discuss how to move forward." She reached into her briefcase with deliberate, careful movements, making sure that everyone could see exactly what she was doing. Her fingers found the leather folder that contained her judicial credentials, and she pulled it out slowly. As she opened the folder, Patricia was aware that everyone in the lobby was watching her. Court employees, lawyers, defendants, witnesses, security guards, they all seemed to sense that something significant was about to be revealed. The judicial identification was clear and official. It bore the seal of the state court system and Patricia's photograph, along with her full title, the Honorable Patricia Williams, Judge of the Criminal Division. Karen Rodriguez was the first to read it, and the color drained from her face. She had been a police officer for 18 years, and she had never seen anything like this. One of her officers had just assaulted a sitting judge. "Judge Williams," Karen said, her voice filled with horror and disbelief. "I am so sorry. I had no idea." "Of course you didn't," Patricia replied calmly. "You weren't here when this started, but your officers were, and they chose not to listen when I tried to identify myself." Danny Torres finally understood what he had done. The woman he had suspected of being a criminal, the person he had treated with contempt and ultimately struck across the face, was a judge. Not just any judge, but one of the most senior judges in the courthouse. I didn't know," Danny stammered. "You didn't look like—" "I didn't look like what, Officer Torres?" Patricia asked. "I didn't look like a judge? And what exactly does a judge look like?" The question hung in the air, and everyone in the lobby knew the answer. Danny had made assumptions based on Patricia's race, assumptions that had led him to treat her with suspicion and hostility from the very beginning. Michael Collins finally found his voice. "Judge Williams, I am deeply sorry for what happened here. My partner's actions were completely inappropriate and unprofessional." Patricia looked at Michael with interest. Throughout the confrontation, she had noticed that he seemed uncomfortable with his partner's behavior. He had tried several times to de-escalate the situation, though he hadn't been forceful enough to prevent the ultimate assault. "Officer Collins," Patricia said, "while I appreciate your apology, I have to point out that you stood by and watched while your partner violated my rights and ultimately assaulted me. You had multiple opportunities to intervene, and you chose not to." Michael felt shame wash over him. Judge Williams was right. He had known that Danny was wrong, but he hadn't been brave enough to stand up to his partner when it mattered most. The crowd in the lobby was growing as word spread throughout the courthouse that something extraordinary was happening. Lawyers were coming down from their offices on upper floors. Court clerks were leaving their posts to see what the commotion was about. Even some judges had heard about the incident and were making their way to the lobby. Judge Robert Thompson, who had been Patricia's mentor when she first joined the bench, pushed through the crowd with a look of concern on his face. When he saw Patricia holding her cheek, his expression changed to one of anger. "Patricia, what happened?" he asked. "Judge Thompson," she replied formally, aware that their interaction was being watched and recorded. "I was assaulted by Officer Torres while attempting to enter the courthouse and go about my normal duties." The word "assaulted" sent a shockwave through the crowd. People began talking more loudly, and the atmosphere in the lobby became charged with tension and disbelief. Court Security Chief Raymond Foster had been called to the scene and was now surveying the situation. He had worked courthouse security for 12 years, and he had never dealt with anything like this. An assault on a judge was not just a crime. It was an attack on the entire judicial system. "Judge Williams," Raymond said, approaching carefully. "Do you need medical attention? Should I call an ambulance?" Patricia considered the question. Her cheek was sore and still red from the slap, but she wasn't seriously injured. More importantly, She was concerned about how this incident would be perceived if it escalated further. "I don't require medical treatment," she said, "but I do want everything that happened here to be thoroughly documented. I assume the security cameras captured the entire incident?" Raymond nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. We have multiple angles of the entire confrontation." The moment Judge Patricia Williams held up her judicial identification, the atmosphere in the courthouse lobby changed completely. What had been a crowd of curious onlookers became a group of witnesses to something unprecedented in the building's long history. Attorney Robert Chen, who had been practicing law for 23 years, later said that he had never seen anything like the collective intake of breath that swept through the lobby when people realized what they were looking at. The leather folder containing Judge Williams' credentials was held high enough for dozens of people to see clearly, and the official seal of the state court system was unmistakable. "Oh my God," whispered Maria Santos, a court clerk who had been on her way to deliver some files when the commotion started. "That's Judge Williams. They attacked Judge Williams." The ripple effect of recognition spread through the crowd like wildfire. People who worked in the courthouse knew Judge Williams by sight, and those who didn't were quickly informed by their neighbors about who she was and what her position meant. Officer Danny Torres felt his legs go weak as the full weight of his actions hit him. The woman he had treated with such contempt, the person he had suspected of criminal activity, the individual he had ultimately slapped across the face, was one of the most powerful people in the building. She wasn't just any judge. She was the presiding judge of the criminal division, which meant she had authority over the very types of cases that he and his fellow officers regularly brought to court. "Judge Williams," Danny said, his voice cracking. I had no idea. I'm so sorry." Patricia looked at him with a mixture of sadness and disappointment that was somehow worse than anger would have been. "Officer Torres, the problem isn't that you didn't know I was a judge. The problem is how you treated me before you knew who I was." Her words cut through the lobby noise like a blade. Several people nodded in agreement, understanding exactly what she meant. Danny's behavior hadn't been wrong because he had assaulted a judge. It had been wrong because he had assaulted another human being based on prejudice and assumptions. Lieutenant Karen Rodriguez was experiencing what felt like an out-of-body experience. In 18 years of law enforcement, she had dealt with officer misconduct before, but nothing approaching this level of catastrophe. One of her officers had committed assault and battery on a sitting judge in front of dozens of witnesses in the courthouse lobby. She couldn't imagine how to begin explaining this to her superiors. "Judge Williams," Karen said, stepping forward carefully, "I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for what has happened here today. This is completely unacceptable behavior, and I want you to know that it will be dealt with in the strictest possible manner." Patricia studied the lieutenant's face and saw genuine horror and regret there. Karen Rodriguez had a reputation as a fair and competent supervisor, and Patricia knew that she was probably just as shocked by her officer's behavior as everyone else. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," Patricia replied, "I appreciate your words, but I'm more interested in your actions. What steps are you prepared to take to ensure that something like this never happens again?" The question hung in the air, because everyone in the lobby wanted to hear the answer. This wasn't just about punishing Officer Torres. It was about addressing the systemic issues that had led to this moment. Meanwhile, word of the incident was spreading throughout the courthouse with remarkable speed. Court employees were sending text messages to colleagues on other floors. Lawyers were calling their offices to report what they had witnessed. Within minutes, judges in their chambers were hearing about the assault on Judge Williams. Judge Robert Thompson, who had mentored Patricia when she first joined the bench, was standing near the elevator doors with a look of barely controlled fury on his face. He had watched Patricia face discrimination and challenges throughout her career, and he was outraged that she had been subjected to this kind of treatment in what should have been a safe and respectful environment. "Patricia," Judge Thompson said, using her first name deliberately to show his personal support, "what do you need from us right now?" Patricia appreciated the gesture, but she was also aware that every word and action was being scrutinized by the crowd around them. She needed to handle this situation not just as Patricia Williams, the victim of an assault, but as Judge Williams, a representative of the entire judicial system. "Judge Thompson," she said formally, "I think the most important thing right now is to ensure that this incident is properly documented and investigated. The integrity of our court system depends on how we respond to this kind of misconduct." Her words were carefully chosen to emphasize the institutional aspects of what had happened, rather than just the personal injury she had suffered. Patricia understood that this incident had implications far beyond her own experience. Officer Michael Collins was struggling with his own role in what had happened. He had known that his partner was wrong from the very beginning, but he had failed to take decisive action to stop the confrontation. Now he was facing the realization that his inaction had contributed to one of the worst incidents of police misconduct in the department's recent history. "Judge Williams," Michael said, stepping forward, "I want to take responsibility for my part in this. I should have stopped my partner before things went this far. I failed in my duty as a police officer." Patricia looked at Michael with something that might have been respect. It took courage to admit fault in front of so many people, especially when you were likely to face discipline or even criminal charges as a result. "Officer Collins," she said, "while I appreciate your honesty, the time for intervention was before. Your partner struck me, not after. However, your willingness to acknowledge your mistake suggests that you might be capable of learning from this experience." Court Security Chief Raymond Foster was already coordinating with his team to secure the scene and preserve evidence. He had called for additional security officers to help manage the growing crowd, and he was making arrangements to copy all of the surveillance footage from the incident. "Judge Williams," Raymond said, approaching respectfully, "we have the entire incident recorded from multiple angles. Would you like us to contact the district attorney's office to begin criminal proceedings?" The question sparked intense interest from everyone in the lobby. Would Judge Williams press charges against the officers? The decision would send a powerful message about accountability and justice. Patricia considered the question carefully. As a judge, she understood the importance of holding law enforcement accountable for misconduct, but she also knew that her response to this incident would be watched and analyzed by people far beyond the courthouse lobby. "Mr. Foster," she said, "I believe that decision should be made by the appropriate authorities after they have had a chance to review all of the evidence. My role here is not to be the prosecutor. It's to be a witness to what happened." Her answer demonstrated the kind of judicial restraint and respect for due process that had made her a respected figure in the legal community. Even as the victim of assault, she was maintaining her commitment to proper procedures and the rule of law. Danny Torres was becoming increasingly agitated as he began to understand the full scope of the consequences he was facing. Assault on a judge was a felony in their state, and it would likely result in federal civil rights charges as well. His career in law enforcement was over, and he was probably looking at significant prison time. "Judge Williams," Danny said desperately, "please, I know I made a terrible mistake. Is there any way we can work this out? I have a family, children. I never meant for this to happen." The plea for mercy created an uncomfortable silence in the lobby. Everyone understood that Danny Torres was facing the destruction of his life and career, but they also knew that actions had consequences. Patricia looked at the young officer with something that might have been pity. "Officer Torres, I understand that you're frightened about what's going to happen to you, but I want you to think about something. What if I hadn't been a judge? What if I had been just an ordinary citizen trying to go about my business? Would your actions have been any less wrong?" The question forced Danny to confront the reality of what he had done. He hadn't assaulted Judge Williams because she was a judge. He had assaulted a woman because of his own prejudices and anger, and the fact that she turned out to be a judge was irrelevant to the moral weight of his actions. "No, ma'am," Danny said quietly. "It would have been just as wrong." "Then you understand why I can't simply make this go away," Patricia replied. "If we don't hold people accountable for this kind of behavior, then we're saying that it's acceptable to treat others with violence and disrespect as long as they don't happen to hold positions of authority." Her words resonated throughout the lobby because they addressed the fundamental principles of justice and equality that were supposed to govern their society. This wasn't about protecting the dignity of judges. It was about protecting the dignity of all people. Attorney Jennifer Walsh had been taking notes throughout the confrontation, and she realized that she was witnessing something that would likely become a landmark case in police accountability and civil rights law. Judge Williams, Jennifer said, "I think I speak for everyone here when I say." 3 hours after the incident in the courthouse lobby, Judge Patricia Williams sat in her chambers, still trying to process everything that had happened. The red mark on her cheek had faded somewhat, but she could still feel the sting of Officer Torres's slap every time she moved her face. Her desk was covered with messages from colleagues, friends, and family members who had heard about the assault. Her phone had been ringing constantly, with calls from reporters, legal organizations, and civil rights groups all wanting to know her response to what many were already calling a watershed moment in police accountability. Patricia's husband, David, had rushed to the courthouse as soon as she called him, and he was now sitting in one of the chairs across from her desk, still looking shaken by what she had told him. "I can't believe this happened," David said for the third time since arriving. "In the courthouse of all places. You should be safe there." "Nobody should have to worry about being safe from police officers," Patricia replied. "Not in a courthouse, not on the street, not anywhere. That's the real issue here." There was a soft knock on her chamber door, and Chief Judge Anderson entered with a grim expression on his face. "Patricia," he said, "I've just gotten off the phone with the State Attorney General's office. They're going to be taking over the investigation and prosecution of this case. They want to send a clear message that assaults on judicial officers will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." Patricia nodded. She had expected as much. An assault on a sitting judge was not just a local crime. It was an attack on the entire judicial system, and the state would respond accordingly. "Have you heard anything about Officer Torres?" she asked. "He's been arrested and charged with assault and battery, civil rights violations, and misconduct under color of authority," Chief Judge Anderson replied. "His partner is facing charges of failure to intervene and conspiracy. Both officers have been terminated from the police department." The swift action by law enforcement and judicial authorities was sending a clear message throughout the community. What had happened to Judge Williams would not be tolerated or overlooked. Meanwhile, across town at police headquarters, the atmosphere was tense and subdued. Chief of Police Robert Martinez was holding an emergency meeting with his senior staff, trying to figure out how to respond to what was already being called the worst incident of police misconduct in the department's recent history. "How did this happen?" Chief Martinez asked his assembled commanders. "How did we end up with an officer who thought it was acceptable to slap a judge in a courthouse lobby?" Lieutenant Rodriguez, who had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, spoke up from her seat at the conference table. "Chief, with all due respect, this isn't just about one bad officer. Officer Torres had a pattern of aggressive behavior and racial bias that his supervisors, including me, failed to address properly. We all bear some responsibility for what happened today." The honesty of her admission surprised some of the other commanders, but Chief Martinez appreciated her willingness to take accountability. "What are you saying, Lieutenant?" he asked. "I'm saying that we need to take a hard look at our training, our supervision, and our culture," Rodriguez replied. "Officer Torres didn't become a racist overnight. The signs were there, and we ignored them." Back at the courthouse, word of the incident was spreading far beyond the local community. Social media posts about the assault were going viral, and news outlets from around the country were picking up the story. The security camera footage of the incident had been leaked to several media organizations, and the video was being played on news programs across the nation. Judge Williams' response to the assault was being praised by legal experts and civil rights leaders. Her dignity under pressure and her measured approach to seeking justice were being held up as examples of how the legal system should respond to misconduct and discrimination. Dr. Angela Robinson, a professor of criminal justice at the local university, was watching the news coverage of the incident from her office. She had known Judge Williams for several years and had always admired her commitment to fairness and justice. "This is exactly the kind of leadership we need," Dr. Robinson told a reporter who had called for comment. "Judge Williams is showing that the response to injustice should be more justice, not revenge." She's using this terrible experience as an opportunity to address systemic problems. The reporter asked Dr. Robinson about the broader implications of the incident. What you have to understand, Dr. Robinson explained, is that this incident represents something much larger than one officer's misconduct. It's about the assumptions and biases that too many people in our society still hold about black women, about authority, and about who deserves respect. At the same time, community organizer Marcus Thompson was coordinating a peaceful demonstration outside the courthouse. The crowd had grown to several hundred people, representing a cross-section of the community united in their outrage over the assault on Judge Williams. "We're here today not just to support Judge Williams," Marcus told the assembled crowd, "but to demand accountability and change. What happened in that courthouse lobby this morning could have happened to any of us. The only difference is that Judge Williams had the power and platform to demand justice." The demonstration remained peaceful throughout the afternoon, with speakers from various community organizations calling for police reform and greater accountability. Several of the speakers noted that Judge Williams had specifically asked for peaceful responses to the incident, and they were honoring her wishes. Inside the courthouse, Judge Williams was meeting with investigators from the State Attorney General's office. Special Agent Lisa Chen was leading the investigation, and she was impressed by Judge Williams's detailed and methodical account of what had happened. "Judge Williams," Agent Chen said, "I want you to know that this case is going to receive the highest priority from our office. We're treating this as both a criminal assault and a federal civil rights violation." Patricia appreciated the thoroughness of the investigation, but she was more interested in the long-term implications of the case. "Agent Chen," she said, "while I want to see justice done in this particular case, I'm more concerned about preventing future incidents like this. What can we do to address the underlying problems that led to Officer Torres's behavior?" Agent Chen consulted her notes. "Well, we're going to be recommending a comprehensive review of the police department's training procedures, hiring practices, and disciplinary policies. We're also going to suggest that they implement mandatory bias training and create a civilian oversight board to review complaints of misconduct." The recommendations represented a significant change in how the police department would operate, and Patricia was encouraged by the scope of the proposed reforms. 2 weeks after the incident, Officer Danny Torres appeared in court for his arraignment on the criminal charges he was facing. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and fellow police officers who had come to show their support for accountability. Torres had hired attorney Mark Davidson to represent him, and Davidson was arguing that his client's actions, while wrong, didn't rise to the level of felony assault. "Your Honor," Davidson told the judge, "my client made a serious error in judgment, but he was acting under stressful circumstances and believed he was dealing with a potential security threat. He deeply regrets his actions and is prepared to accept responsibility for his mistakes." The prosecutor, Assistant Attorney General Jennifer Walsh, countered that Torres's actions were clearly criminal and racially motivated. "Your Honor," Walsh argued, "the defendant didn't just make an error in judgment. He profiled Judge Williams, based on her race, refused to listen when she tried to identify herself, and then assaulted her when she stood up for her rights. This was a deliberate violation of her civil rights under color of authority." The judge ultimately decided to allow the case to proceed to trial, rejecting a plea agreement that would have resulted in a lighter sentence for Torres. Meanwhile, the police department was implementing the reforms recommended by the Attorney General's office. Chief Martinez had announced the creation of a new community oversight board, mandatory bias training for all officers, and a revised use of force policy that emphasized de-escalation techniques. Lieutenant Rodriguez, who had been allowed to return to duty after completing additional training, was put in charge of implementing many of the new policies. "We have to acknowledge that we failed Judge Williams," Rodriguez told her officers during a department-wide meeting. "But more than that, we failed the community we're supposed to serve. These reforms are our chance to rebuild trust and do better." 6. Months after the incident, the trial of Danny Torres began. The courthouse was once again packed with observers, and the trial was being covered by national media outlets. Judge Williams testified on the first day of the trial, describing in detail what had happened in the courthouse lobby. Her testimony was powerful and emotional, but she maintained her composure throughout the questioning. The physical assault was painful, she told the jury, but the real harm was to the principle that all people deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race or apparent status in society.